you just put out a new book on electronic music, Mars by 1980, the story of electronic music, a personal history with electronic music. And since I'm such a generous and liberal podcast host, you can choose between two themes. We're going to start with either the act of writing or the notion that technology comes first when it comes to the development of electronic music and music production.
Probably the act of writing, in the sense of those two, just because the book isn't really a kind of techie sort of handbook or anything like that. I'm not quite so interested in that. Some people that are involved in electronic music can be quite nerdy about it and about, and almost like get fascinated by the kind of the wiring and the knobs and, and the intricacies of all of that. I'm not really a kind of expert on that. And what I was emphasizing and focusing was the way that electronic music has sat in the world, from the point of view of the consumer, its kind of implications, their sort of philosophy, behind it, or issues like that. Really, it's social impact. Why, how it's kind of expressed people's kind of hopes and fears. And why people are afraid of electronic music. Why some people have thought in the past it was, and still do now, and to some degree think it's inauthentic, that it's cheating, or that it's unhuman, for instance, and I would counter all of those things.
Yeah, we're going to talk more about the human aspect of the robotic and everything. But like you as a writer, was it fun to write this book?
Yeah, it was actually. I mostly did it in the Barbican library, not actually the library, but the kind of open space there. I actually find if you try and work in a library itself, it's a little bit tense because somebody always breaches the silence, and then you kind of get tense, and but it's great just to sort of, I find it really good to work in an environment where there's just a low level chatter.
Okay.
And I find that perfect, because then you don't have to worry about everyone's making a bit of noise and it doesn't matter, so you don't have to be kind of invigilating and on the alert for anybody that's breaching the silence. So it's an ideal place. Also,
in terms of architecture, I mean, the Barbican Center is just
it's inspiring, yes, in that respect, and it's an open, public, free space, and there's something idealistic about that. Plus, another thing is, if you write at home, anybody that's a writer will tell you that the classic urge is to go and procrastinate, to go and to tidy up, for instance. If you're in the Barbican, you're not going to tidy up the Barbican, you just so I think that's a good way of writing.
You've been writing now for 33 years. How has you changed? How have you changed as a writer, and your view on writing about music?
I sometimes read the very early things that I did, and I just think, you cocky little shit. It's very good. There was a lot of the arrogance of youth. You used to take great pleasure in sort of slating artists and giving one-star reviews or whatever, and stomping all over people. And I take far less pleasure in that now. I think as you get older and you meet musicians and you realise that even if they've not necessarily made the perfect record, the kind of effort that they put into it and the sense of deep disappointment when people just trounce it, at least in the press. There is still room for that kind of thing, I think. But as I get older, I find, I'm just much sort of mellower. Another thing that changed writing hugely was the arrival of the internet. For a start, it meant there's a lot less money in the game because people expect to download, read things for free, whereas before they had to pay. But also, from the point of view of a writer, I've forgotten actually what it was like before Google or Wikipedia. What did you do? You needed to find a fact. There were sort of cuttings libraries, but they might have been recycling, old facts that turn out not necessarily to be true. And writing, the way I used to write before the internet was much more, and the way writing was generally, it was much more impressionistic, subjective, full of adjectives and things like that. It didn't really, from a research point of view, anybody looking at it now, they'll go through 3,000 words and think, there's only one fact in here. But now I think articles tend to be, there's an expectation that articles are almost like fleshed out Wikipedia entries, and there's a sort of skeleton of facts that people feel, you have to make it feel authentic. I mean, I'm a bit skeptical about that. I mean, I think there's a difference between facts and truth, but there you go.
Yeah. How about the music critique? Norway, for example, has a very strong tradition of literary criticism. Not that proud and strong tradition as far as music criticism. And I would say that would go for the whole world, wouldn't it? And it's desperately needed, music criticism. How do you see music criticism has evolved post-internet?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's much harder. It's much harder for people to make a living. I think that if you do make it, you're really probably going to be very, very good. I think that the standard of writing that does make it is really, really high. But there isn't necessarily there isn't the space that there used to be, despite the fact there seem to be a lot more magazines. There isn't. There aren't the same number of people paying attention. Because it's so diffuse, really, and
so the classic album review doesn't mean as much anymore. Is that what you're saying?
No, that's right. I used to write for Melody Maker and also NME, and these were the only places that you could get information about these bands, and especially in the 1970s, before my time. So Melody Maker would sell 220,000 copies a week, because in those days, when you had these massive bands like Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, and whatever, The Who, but you never saw them mentioned in like national newspapers. They weren't celebrities. I mean, they just sort of were up there in this kind of sort of, barrage balloon out there in space, really. These great kind of remote Olympian figures. The only time I realized it was such a band as Pink Floyd, it was a tiny column that big in the Daily Express listing that Dark Side of the Moon, still #1 best-selling album, for like the past sort of 2 years. Oh, it's weird. Who is this Pink Floyd bloke? It seems to be, why would I never see anything about him? If it was Gary Glitter or something like that, he'd be all over the place, or the Osmonds. You could read about them everywhere. But the actual rock stars of the day were these very remote Olympian figures, and the only place you could really find out about them was in places like Melody Maker and NME. That changed in the 1990s. Somebody like Pulp, for instance, all of a sudden you could read about them in the Sunday Telegraph, right-wing sort of magazine, newspaper. So that made a big difference, that and then the internet.
People freaked out when Dylan went electric, and there's a lot of hostility towards the technology and the idea of the inauthentic electronic aspect of music. Why is that? And
Well, it's interesting. The Dylan thing. I mean, him going electric was for the ultra purists or whatever, that electricity should be involved in music making at all. But I think that electric guitars in themselves became a sort of form of new authenticity that was contrary to in principle, in a way, to the idea of like electronic music. So with electronic guitar, electronic guitarist, adopts these very sort of gendered, heroic postures. There's lots of sweat and passion, and it's really an effort, and you have to really work hard to figure out all that kind of thing. The value of virtuosity, of like demonstrable passion and energy and sincerity and all that kind of thing, and which made the idea of like electronic music seem like something kind of cold and laboratory-like and frigid, because it's completely the contrast. It's not about virtuosity, it's about organized sound. And there's also this idea that it's cheating somehow. You're taking a shortcut. You're not earning a spurs. You're not learning, all of that. But in the end, I think that it was a long time, I think, before that sort of hegemony of like, generally male rock guitarists, generally white, with the exception of Andrex, of course. And I think it was a long time. Also, in the early days, like the Moog synthesizer was introduced in 1967 at the Monterey Pop Festival. And I think there was this idea that like this represents the sound of the future, but not now. And in the meantime, it was almost used as a kind of gimmicky thing, an add-on. It was used by people like Simon & Garfunkel, the Monkees, the Beach Boys, and then the Beatles, but always in a very sort of peripheral, bolted-on way, incidental way. It was never, nobody built tracks around, the Moog synth, or if they did, then that would be considered something very, very sort of avant-garde and out there, or very, very kitschy, sort of a Robbie the Robot type vibe. And that was really the sort of place that synthesizers had in the culture in the late 1960s, even though they were there and had been invented. Also, they were very expensive, they're very volatile. There's this famous YouTube video of Keith Richards trying to get to grips with a Moog synthesizer. Fuck it now. Fuck it now.
Not being quite the guitar hero.
And it was a mini Moog that Mick Jagger had bought that eventually found its way into the hands of Tangerine Dream. It was their first Moog synthesizer.
Wow.
So it found a good home. Yeah, it's exactly the same model. But then I think the first person to really understand that art and Moog synthesizers could be central to music was Stevie Wonder, of all people. I think that he was being blind. I think that he was prepared to kind of immerse himself in all the kind of hard work and his world, his pure world of sound or whatever. And he had this kind of great patience, constant like night and day don't really mean sort of as much to him. And so he was prepared to spend hours and hours and hours working with these machines, thanks, with Bob, with Michael Cecil and Bob Margolef, helping him out there. And he creates this series of albums from Music of My Mind, right through to Songs in the Key of Life, in which synthesizers are central. But what he demonstrates, and he demonstrates this pretty much for all time, is that synthesizers don't have to be kind of cold, remote, alien, impersonal sort of instruments, that he uses them as a kind of, he creates sort of deep, soulful music using these instruments as a kind of sound palette. He creates these sort of dark, sort of limpid, wonderful, melancholy tracks, or these kind of surging, euphoric, funky tracks. And synthesizers are the means whereby he does that. So he shows how synthesizers could enhance all the traditional properties of great soul music. I mean, James Brown, talks about Sex Machine or whatever, but he's using sort of proper instruments or whatever. I mean, his music is almost honorary electronic music in that it's so precise and pinpoint, rigid, whatever. But Stevie Wonder then demonstrates how synthesizers, and they always have been ever since, in R&B.
Is that where, was it with Stevie Wonder where electronic R&B or where R&B went electric? Is that like how you see it?
Yes, definitely, yeah. I mean, I think he's the one that really does it in a thoroughgoing way. He's not probably the first ever sort of soul artist to use a synthesizer, but he's the one I think that really does it in a kind of wonderful, thoroughgoing way that's still listenable, eminently listenable to this day.
Let's talk about human emotion and the idea of humanity through the use of electronic music, through the notions of the robotic and the machine-like. Why is there so much emotion to be conveyed through these things? Isn't it ironic?
It is kind of ironic, but then if you know Star Trek at all, The Next Generation. Now you might know Commander Data, who's the android, and he is probably he's probably a lot of people's favorite character in that. And one of the reasons why is that he is fascinated and intrigued by the idea of what it is to be human, not being human himself, and what human emotions are, or what you feel like, and I think that there's a sort of poignancy that you get if you hear sort of people using vocoders or voice boxes, especially again going back to Daft Punk, the way that they use it, there's something really kind of moving. It's almost
Why?
like
Because it's fragile,
yearning.
because it's broken,
and
just like our souls and our...
Yeah, it's like a sort of yearning for some sort of emotional fulfillment. And a lot of other pop music that takes more traditional lines towards expressing emotion. I mean, big sort of rock singers or soul singers, Yeah. I mean, that can sound incredibly kind of like emotionally fulfilled, but it's almost like a set of gymnastic exercises, really. And it becomes cliched after a while. And this is what happened to rock music in the end. And I think this is why Kraftwerk were eventually able to kind of lay the foundations for the supplanting of rock music in a way, was because all that eventually it just became tired and cliche,
kind of sport,
worn out.
But how taking autotune as an example of how do you feel about the conveying of emotion and the human soul through autotune?
Yeah,
to me the vocoder and autotune is related, obviously, and to me it represents something broken and something squeaky, metallic, and
well, I mean, I think the auto-tune is perhaps the sort of the last bastion of people sort of having a kind of synthephobia and thinking that electronic music isn't authentic, that this is faking it, it's cheating. There's a lot of that, and perhaps that's the case with with some music. But auto-tune can also be used really, really effectively. There's an electronic art based in the UK called Sophie. And the way that she uses auto-tune and the way that she uses kind of, she has a very kind of fractured take on electronic music. It raises all these wonderful issues of like sort of cultural identity, gender and things like that, and a sort of fluidity that you can achieve in life as well as in music, and she demonstrates it in a sense in music. I think that's, and I think that's wonderful, and that's something that you could only really do using electronics, using things like autotune, is almost say, look, you don't just have, you can become, you can transform. You don't just have to, you're not condemned to be one thing. You can be liquid, you can be fluid, and her music conveys that.
Yeah, you mentioned that yesterday in your talk. Don't be, you can become. Wasn't that sort of an ethos for the Afrofuturists as well?
Well, yeah. I mean, again, yes, I talked about this, that I think that from people like Sun Ra onwards, and Sun Ra was the first person really to use electronics in jazz, which was considered very, very taboo thing to do, and especially the kind of extreme way in which he kind of used the sort of Moog synthesizer in the 1960s. And I mean, he was a very sort of garish, eccentric character. He had an obsession with ancient Egyptology and also the future, and claimed to be born on the planet Saturn. And I think from people like him onwards, through to like, again, sort of, Stevie Wonders, but much more on a recent times, with all the kind of developments in dance music, whatever, that there is this concept of Afrofuturism. Why would that be? And to me, I always think that like white musicians, white consumers of rock and pop music do tend to be quite nostalgic. A lot of their kind of tastes are sort of slightly kitschy, and it's just like, weren't the 30s great? Weren't the 40s great? Weren't the 50s great? Weren't the 60s great? Well, it says, not if you were black, they weren't. These were times of, of like segregation, of lynching, of civil rights struggle. You do not look fondly back on the past. The present isn't that great either, but maybe in the future there's a chance. And I think that's why there's always a strong futuristic inclination in contemporary, black music.
There's also, speaking of black culture, there's a will there to get your hands on a certain kind of technology and fuck with it.
Yeah.
Fuck it up. The record player, with scratching, with the use of auto-tune, and with Zap, with the use of the vocoder.
Yeah.
I heard Zap this morning. What a great band. There's a direct link between, Ohio 1980 and Skrillex, It's fucking so futuristic.
But, fucking up is exactly the right word. That's exactly the attitude that people should have towards this kind of machinery, which wasn't necessarily always designed with creativity in mind, and even like the vocoder itself was like, a kind of wartime instrument that was used for I can't remember the exact science because I'm rubbish on it, but it certainly wasn't intended for Roger Troutman out of Zap, or people like that, or whoever.
But isn't this the essence of sound progression?
Tear up the presets.
Like kids from the street have the balls and the restlessness and the attitude just to fuck it up.
That's right. I mean, you really should have a sexual relationship with your machinery. Almost.
Yeah.
It really should be like, you should be fucking up, should be tearing out the presets, rewiring, messing it up, whatever. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and the same goes with,
and I think
the use of auto-tune with the whole, the way Future uses it and the whole modern rap scene uses it. Yeah. And even with the bass, the new paradigm of low-end sonics in music, the speakers are getting better, and people are really pushing the limits in terms of the whole bass frequency.
And again, this idea, obviously people have this great fear of machinery and AI, and the idea that these things, could dominate, and that might well be legitimate. But I think that, this is why my favorite kind of electronic music is where the machine itself is being subverted, it's being messed up, people are grabbing it, and physically, it's that human engagement and that human involvement that's always important. Yeah. And
also with hip hop and with a 808 drum machine and the whole, they didn't try to emulate rock drummers.
No, absolutely, yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about more specific bands in your book. Suicide, Tangerine Dream. We mentioned Zap, Kraftwerk. I'm a vocalist myself. I come from punk rock, hardcore, but I'm doing electronic stuff now. HR from the Bad Brains was a big inspiration. I saw Alan Vega from the Suicide. Probably one of the most dangerous and intense front figures in the history of music.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Suicide, compared with somebody as incredibly serene as Kraftwerk or whatever, Suicide, it was almost like they were at war when they were on stage, and they genuinely were. I mean, they were the first band really to be described as punk way back about 1971, and even then they were using basically vocals and a sort of electronic, back in drum machines and things like that, and just this kind of reducing. It was in a sense rock reduced this kind of just this basic pulse. It wasn't even three chords; it was like one chord or whatever. It was more extreme than punk, and they emerged. And they made their debut album in 1977. They'd been around a long time at that point, about 10 years. And they started touring with, various sort of punk, post-punk type bands. And they were in Belgium. I was actually at the venue where this happened, doing a talk a few months ago. And Elvis Costello was topping the bill. And And they come on and they just do things like Frankie Teardrop and reggae, you know, and they got this kind of Alan Vega, who was this kind of sort of mutant sort of Elvis type sort of figure. You know, he's like sort of scratching himself and like, you know, and he's, you know,
electronic punk Elvis.
You know, self-harming on stage and really throwing himself into the drama, you know, absorbing all of the kind of pain, inflicting pain on himself and having pain inflicting on him. You know, there's people throwing axes or whatever like that on stage and stuff. And really, in a sense, you know, winding up this audience, they're here to hear something. They think they're kind of punk, they think they're at leading edge, but what they really want is actually something quite orthodox and tuneful in the form of Elvis Costello and the guitar-based. And so this is a real kind of violation, having something like Suicide turn up, these two, who are really too extreme for them, so they react violently. You know, it's a bit like the kind of outrages used to get in the early 20th century at Stravinsky and stuff like that. And they react with real violence. And at one point, there's a recording of it called 23 Minutes Over Brussels. And it's just 23 minutes of sheer chaos in which they steal their mic, or, you know, off the stage or whatever. And then they won't until they get it back. And eventually, Elvis Costello himself, to his credit, when he came on stage, he cut short his set after 10 minutes because he was so disgusted with the way that Suicide were treated. And that caused a real riot.
There's also a kind of 50s nostalgia in Suicide in their music. I hear that, at least. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, but it's because it's going, I think it's almost like going back to a sort of elemental basics of rock or whatever, and sort of that Elvis,
yeah.
And I think
speaking of Elvis,
yes.
If we were to look a little bit into the crystal ball, you know, if Bach would have heard Hendrix sing rendering of the Star Spangled Banner, he would have shit his pants. If Hendrix would have heard Future or something like that, some modern day hip hop or whatever, he would have shit his pants. And there's no point in having the illusion that we're not gonna see some crazy sonic shifts and inventions in the coming 20 years, is there? Or?
It's maybe. I mean, when Stockhausen was presented with modern examples of like techno, he didn't exactly shit his pants. He was kind of just disappointed. He actually found it quite kind of limited, really, compared to quite
boring
tonal.
minimalism.
Yeah, that's right. He really found it. You know, he hated repetition. You know, so when he listened to it, he didn't really know any of these people are, but he. I think he was hoping that he was hoping for all kinds of weird things to happen to humanity. He was hoping that in a few generations' time, we did somehow, with all the kind of evolutions, you know, mechanical and technological things, that human beings might somehow evolve themselves to travel at the speed of light through the universe. I mean, people like the futurists, they dreamt that people would be able to kind of fly, you know, physically fly. I mean, we've got airplanes, you know, surely the next step is people being able to sort of take to the skies like birds into some sort of like, you know, becoming semi-mechanical creatures. You know, these are the kind of crazy, wonderful dreams that people had in the 20th century that were triggered and ignited by the arrival of like mechanization and the music that went with it, you know, which kind of created these kind of potential future visions. I mean, one of the reasons why I call the book Mars by 1980 is it was going back to... in the mid-80s, I decided to write a project about the year 1975 and going back and looking at newspapers. And all the newspapers back then they were talking about, you know, we'd just done the moon. The last time there was a sort of that people set foot on the moon was 1972. And to be honest, by that point, people were just bored with it. The moon, I've done it. It was 17th time. And so people thought, well, we've got to go, you know, next, Mars. And people were talking about, you know, traveling on to Mars. That was the next one. And by the year 1980, you know, which had this wonderful kind of futuristic feel to it, we're going to be on Mars. And it stalled, and that never really happened. And I think that's something about the culture of the times that we're living in. You know, we're in a sort of post-space age, which is a slightly kind of strange place to be. I mean, in one sense, technologies and music, you know, has kind of, electronic music, you know, has triumphed in lots of ways, but doesn't always necessarily feel so triumphant. We're in this kind of strange sort of diffuse place at the moment that no one really predicted and didn't really square up to the kind of visions and the sort of, you know, and the predictions of futurologists. An odd place.
You know, I was thinking about the arpeggio on the synthesizer. It's just kind of an artificial intelligence already, you know? You just put your 3 fingers down and you get a melody out of it. And you put 3 other fingers down and you get a different melody. And there's all kinds of combinations. And I'm thinking, you know, with algorithms and artificial intelligence and everything, like, say I'm working on a bridge in a song, and then maybe, you know, there will be software in the future where I will get 20 suggestions by MIDI for a chorus. And I mean, things, all kinds of things is going to happen, and then kids are going to start fucking up with that again. And do you have any crystal ball?
No, early on, I mean, I just think that whatever happens, I mean, it is possible clearly that sort of the machinery could get that much more sophisticated, but still, if you're actually in process, there's always got to be the fucking up, they're pulling it to pieces, the subverting it, the tearing out of the presets. I mean, the idea of, I told this story yesterday. I was sitting in my bath the other day, and there was the extractor fan started. It's on its last legs. It needs replacing fairly soon. It started making these weird noises. Can only describe it as a cross between Throbbing Gristle and Steve Reich. This kind of phase industrial sound. And I thought, well, that's intriguing. I should record that. I think no. The idea of machines just making music, auto-generating their own music, is of no interest to me at all. There has to be a sort of active, creative human engagement. I mean,
flesh and blood. Yeah, that tears it up.
That's right. Yeah. So I'm very, very humanistic, as it were, in my kind of, and I think even a lot of like manifestations of electronic music and the robotic or whatever, ultimately are interesting because of the sort of, this kind of latent humanism about them. So I really that's something I very much believe, and I think this is something that perhaps people have traditionally misunderstood about electronic music.
Yeah. You said the latent humanism. How about just saying the profound humanism?
Indeed, yeah.
But it's true though that technology always comes first, and then people start fucking it up.
Yeah.
And yeah, just like I'm sure when Hendrix did his Star Spangled Banner on Woodstock, the guitar makers didn't have that sound in mind, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I always think that with Jimi Hendrix, I always think of him as an honorary electronic musician, really, and I think of Electric Ladyland, which is actually my favourite album of all time, made in 1968, 51 years ago. Impressing. I think, in a way, that is the first post-rock album, because by 1968, he's always taken like the sonic possibilities of electric guitar to absolute extremes. He's kind of burnt down, as it were, metaphorically, rock music as it stood. And then the energies that are kind of released on that, on some of the kind of tracks, like, for instance, 1983, A Merman I Should Turn to Be, it's almost like this kind of sheer oceanic kind of sprawl of sound, and this is what comes when you sort of break the banks of the guitar or whatever, and then suddenly these all kinds of sonic possibilities opened up. And and then that really sort of ushers in the next stage of just operating in the purely electronic field, which is such a more open field. And that's why I think also that incidentally that there's a lot more. My personal theory is there's a lot more women involved, really successful women involved in electronic music than perhaps in the traditional rock world, because there is something very kind of awkwardly gendered about rock. Rock guitar, and
because it's so show offy and sort of like
I mean, plenty of women do that, and obviously get around it. But I just think that electronic music is actually a much more kind of, as it were, despite all the kind, it seemed to be kind of dominated by blokey nerds or whatever. I think that in terms of the actual music and the possibilities of music making, that it seems to be the inordinate number of women have managed to get involved and do really, really good things. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
In fact, most of my current favourite electronic artists are women, actually.
Yeah.
They're doing really, really sort of important work at the moment. Laurel Halo, Sophie, even people like Robin in a different way.
You mentioned the film Eden yesterday.
Yeah.
Eden, everyone slept on Eden in Norway, and I don't think a lot of people saw it at all in the world. It's a great film about European club culture, or not the club culture in the Western world, and it's kind of scary for people like you and me, and a lot of you people that have grown up with clubs, maybe DJ'd a bit, been at rave parties in LA or London, Berlin, whatever, to see like the sort of existentialist dark side of the club world.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it's great. What's fascinating about it is that it's not a success story, it's a failure story. And it's this guy who starts off doing pretty well, but then gradually his fortunes decline. Whereas Daft Punk, who I sort of describe as the sort of anti-Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, those two peripheral Hamlet and Cranmer, they're in the film, but meanwhile their fortunes are rising at the same time. And there is this wonderful scene at the end. It just kind of reminded me of the time when I failed to recognise them, is when they just turn up. They're at the height of their success at this point in Daft Punk, and they just turn up at some nightclub in Paris, and the guy says, "Who are you?" And they just give their names, and Thomas, and said, "You're not on the list, go away." And they go, "Okay," and off they go. There's probably a part of them that would have liked that. And I think that one of the great things about Daft Punk is they did something that Kraftwerk also did, which is they've almost like created a sort of robot selves who take care of bear the brunt of all the sort of oppressive attention and celebrity or whatever, and they get to be their real selves, away from all of that. It's a wonderful way, I think, and a very human and a sane thing to do, is not to kind of expose yourself, to the sort of intense glare of celebrity that you get these days, and also a very unegotistical thing as well. And I think that's in keeping, with electronic music making.
Let's talk about drugs and the involvement of electronic music and how it relates today with music. What are your thoughts on it? Drugs.
To be honest, I'm kind of a drugs virgin, apart from alcohol, which of course, is a drug. And this created a sort of generation gap with me, actually, when Acid House began. Because my involvement in the dance in the early 80s was much more of it's much more of a sort of urban fixated thing. And it was nightclubs, and it was like, closing 2 or 3 in the morning. It was spirits, wines, cocktails, whatever, dance and then get a taxi home. And it was, because, clubs like Beetroot. All of a sudden, there's this transformation. And then, and I loved the evolution of electronic. I love that kind of new minimalism that came in, and that kind of, that back to basics, almost like skeletal sort of sound of Acid House. But the idea that going out for a dance or going to a club was semi-legitimate, that involved, getting in a kind of 3-wheel car and traveling sort of 40 miles to a field or whatever, drinking Lucozade all night and taking, various drugs. That really wasn't my idea of fun. I was only 25. It wasn't that I was too old. There was plenty of people much older than me that embraced it. I suppose for me personally, if you get some rubbish drugs, and I know that a lot of my friends did, your statutory rights are very, very much affected. You can't write to the drugs board and complain. If you get rubbish drugs, you get rubbish drugs. And I don't know, I was just always a little bit cautious in that respect. But no, clearly, there is, clearly the sort of right ecstasy or whatever, and was tied in with the kind of the nature of the music. And it was a sort of temporarily sort of transformative, and it was a sort of transformative moment at that point. It also tied in with what was beginning to happen sort of politically, that sort of dawn of the kind of perhaps false euphoria of the 90s or whatever. So yeah, there was a sort of confluence of all kind of all various things happening there.
Is there a part of your book that you have a special relationship, that you feel is special, that means something special to you?
I start right at the beginning with a little essay about hearing Donna Summer for the first time in 1977, and just being and just trying to sort of convey how dismal life was at that point, growing up in a sort of little village in Leeds, and just how, in a sense, it's more so in the 60s. Most people weren't living in the 60s. They were still living in the 30s and 40s. It was the same in many ways. And even in the 1970s, I lived in a house that was mostly hand-me-down furniture from the 1920s and 30s, and the kind of the with itness was happening to kind of other people on television or whatever. Only just got, probably still had black and white TV at that point and all those kind of things. And so when something like I Feel Love arrives, it's a bit like Star Wars, the same year. It's almost like the future has kind of crash landed, the future has descended, like the planet. It really had such profound impact, on me, just that kind of sequence of innovation, which still, I think people occasionally, it was Giorgio Moroder and his team that did that. It was the one time where Kraftwerk played catch up slightly, is on The Man Machine, where they use a similar kind of sequence of treatment. But yeah, so I suppose that particular thing, just to kind of a sense of, the personal impact,
How old were you?
At this point, well, we're 14, I think.
Yeah. That's the golden age for just sucking in music, isn't it?
But I mean, the wonderful thing is, I think we could do with a bit more scarcity in a sense, really. I mean, that's one of the things that's missing. It's like music just being on tap these days. It loses its financial value, and it loses kind of overall value. I mean, when I first bought those Stevie Wonder albums I was talking about earlier on, I had to save. I had to save up for 4 weeks for doing a paper round, just to afford to get one album. And, I'm just looking at them. And if they hadn't been good albums, or, I'd have bloody well learned to like them at that price. And I'll never get that back. I'll never get that sort of sense of, I'll never. There's nothing I could listen to now. I'm much like most people. Music's on tap or whatever. You can get sort of little epiphanies and things like that, but nothing that's going to be on the scale of being 14 or 15 and hearing the Stevie Wonder album that you've worked for 4 weeks. And then,
does that kind of worry you with the kids growing up now, that they don't have the same sense of ownership or subcultural identity when it comes to music, and they don't have that strong, wow, shit, I have an album in my hand. Yeah. Oh my God. They just grew up with it as wallpaper.
Yeah, this is it. Now music is almost like a kind of data stream, yes, and it's not this big tactile thing. One of the things that actually was my grandma, actually, in the early 70s, she had what's called a radiogram, which is about the size of a sideboard, and all it contained was like a big wireless set and a record player, which could stack 8 singles at once, and play, what will you think of next? And it was as much as like hearing all of these records by people like the Beatles and all these kind of beat groups and Buddy Holly and Diana Ross and the Supremes. It was the aroma of the turntable. It was, or the vinyl, with these things that are
the aroma of the aroma,
the rubber of the turntable. The rubber on the turntable, things like that. That was as alluring as well. The whole physical experience of music making, and clearly that's lost with MP3s.
Yeah. The aroma of the laptop.
Yes, I know. Well, yeah.
But what are you, as a writer, what are your hopes and ambitions, possibly fears, when it comes to music writing in the future and music in general in the future?
I think that, as it were, the fears have kind of come to pass in lots of ways already. Probably one solution would be to kind of knock up a time travel machine and go back and kill Tim Berners-Lee. Basically the internet, I think there's a lot of misplaced idealism as expressed by Daft Punk earlier on about kind of internet, and that it would have what a wonderfully liberating it would be, almost this kind of hippie-ish dream. But the trouble is, it's great that you can. It's not like Star Trek, you've got the replicator and Jean-Luc Picard and say, tea, Earl Grey, hot, and there it appears. It's like you can't download anything. There are only certain things. It's kind of, it's a selective, the things you can get for free. And unfortunately, the things you can get for free, I think, like music and writing. And as a music writer, that has tended to prove somewhat impoverishing, And I'm still not convinced that enough is done to kind of safeguard musicians and writers in terms of whether it's paywalls or just to find ways of getting, people are getting far too used to getting all this stuff for free. And it's just like, it's all very well and good if you can have that society, but then everything else has to be free, flour, pajamas, the law, these are still things you traditionally have to pay for. And so it's a bit unfair on the people whose wares have suddenly kind of been rendered worthless by this technology. And I think also, like I say, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, as they say. I think that more could be done, or people actually, this expectation. People can be so cheeky. Sometimes, I'll say I've just written a piece for a magazine, and somebody will be like, hey, is there anywhere online I can get to read that for nothing? No, it's for sale. It's just like, I need to pay my bills. And people can be extraordinary kind of, oblivious to that aspect of things. So I think in the future, I've certainly got a lot of confidence and faith in the people, in new music writers that are coming through, and a great deal of respect for them. And I think that they probably apply themselves a lot more than perhaps my at times slightly lazy generation, and I'm really impressed, with this. What I'm not is I'm not one of these people who thinks that, of course, in my day we had Joy Division, we had the Sex Pistols. What have you got? I never say that. I don't believe that. I think that kids today are just victims of, a media environment that was created by their elders. And I just think each generation is just a bit better than the last, and so it is with this one. So from that point of view, I've got great hope and faith in that. And I think there's always going to be people who don't just treat music as a sort of data stream, who want to kind of find ways of contextualizing it, find meaning in it, make sense of it, and therefore enhance the experience of listening to it.
David Stubbs, it was such a pleasure having you.
Thank you
David
very much.
Stubbs, everyone.